I am the Binney family curator of the New England Quilt Museum. I've been quilting since the time of the American bicentennial in the 1970s. But in the early 1990s, I fell in love with antique quilts, couldn't afford to buy them. So I started learning how to reproduce them. And that means you have to learn about styles and fabrics. And it took me down this wonderful rabbit hole of quilt history. And when the job came open at the New England Quilt Museum 12 years ago now, who knew that at the age of 59, I would get my dream job? Being a curator at the New England Quilt Museum means that I need to do research about exhibits, find out what people would like to see. And then our byline is to educate and inspire. And this talk came out of a need to educate people about how textiles have been used in social commentary, protest, adoration, comment for more than 1,000 years. So in the 8-week period between July and September of 2017, more than 1,000 people came to see an exhibit called Threads of Resistance. And the images on the screen now are from that exhibit. It was organized by a group of women who call themselves the Artists Circle as a way for fiber artists, primarily quilters, to respond to the 2016 election. They received, to their great surprise, more than 500 submissions, and the curators juried the number down to 67 small pieces that traveled around the country for 2 years. I got to go to my next slide so I remember what it is. Bingo. That is the postcard that they put out. The quilts in the exhibit expressed dismay, anger, fury, and concern for what was going on in our government during that administration. The topics included sexual abuse, economic policies, and concern for immigrants, to name just a few. The majority of our visitors were just overcome by the range of topics that were expressed, but only about, and it surprised me that there were so few, 3 or 4 people were upset that what they considered to be objects made for comfort, i.e. quilts, would be used for any kind of expression. So I put this talk together to educate people about how long textiles have been used. This is just a quick slide that we won't spend a lot of time on. The Artist Circle is the list on the right of your screen, and they actually put out these topics for people to respond to. So when I started digging, looking for textiles that expressed opinions, the first thing that came across my radar screen surprised me. These are details from the bio embroidery. It's also called the bio tapestry, but it's not really a tapestry. It's embroidery on linen. It tells the story of the events of 1064 to 1066, which culminated in the Battle of Hastings. The 2 main characters.
I don't understand why.
I'm sorry, someone's not
Zoom
muted.
does not recognize.
Someone's not muted. Is someone having trouble with Zoom? All right, I'll keep going. The main characters were the recently crowned King of England, who led the Anglo-Saxon English army, and William, the Duke of Normandy, aka William the Conqueror, who led the Norman French army. In the tapestry, which is 224 feet long, there are 50 scenes with a narrative in Latin, which explains what's going on. New scholarship surmises that it was probably constructed in England for display in the Bayeux Cathedral in Normandy, France. And it is, as I said, 18 inches tall and 224 feet long. Then we jump to what has been known as, I'm sorry, before we get there, People of wealth in the Middle Ages had tapestries woven to keep their walls to keep their castles warmer or their great rooms warmer. But the tapestries were also imbued with messages. And this is a particular one about the mistress of the castle, and she's bestowing gifts upon people. But there are the unicorn and the lion were important images from that time period. So if you walked into someone's castle, you might have seen gorgeous tapestries that showed how great the family was, how rich the family was, how well the knight or the king or the prince or whatever did in battle. So it's a textile that was also used to express something about the family, political or strength or whatever. This textile is a close-up of what was known for a long time as the Tristan quilt. It is one, it has two pieces. One of the pieces in the collection of the Victoria and Albert Museum. The other is in the Bargello Museum in Florence, France, Italy, and was made between 1630 and 1400. The recent scholarship tells us that it's not the story of Tristan and Isolde, but it is a narrative of the bad pope attacking the good king of France. And sadly, I don't have the image that shows that, but in other images on the quilted textiles, there are shields that have the first time the fleur-de-lis was used was about this time. And that's how the new research has sorted out that this is really about a political battle. Oops, back. So people do make quilts for warmth. These are two American quilts. The one on the left is actually a bed covering. It's not quilted. They make quilts to give away to family, friends, and also to revered members of their communities. Quilters began adding images in the quilting or the applique, or by writing on their surfaces to express patriotism or support for their causes. And this began in the United States shortly after the Revolution. These two quilts are expressive of the Federalist period, which saw a fad for white work. And included on those they became very patriotic. They were eagles, as you can see in both the coverlet and the quilt. They express bounty. Many of them have sheaves of wheat. The white work one here has clusters of grapes. There are arrangements of stars showing patriotic pride in our newly formed Federation of States. By the end of the first quarter of the 19th century, the same symbols were appearing in hundreds of quilts. The quilt on the right is from the DAR Museum, and again shows the eagle. And it's made of very expensive fabrics. It's called cutwork applique. Those images, the eagle was not cut from fabric, but the floral bouquets are cut from very expensive chintz. There was a fad that started about 1830, 1840, when women began inscribing quilts with their names, place names, and sometimes with messages for the recipient, indicating the nature of the gift. They were called friendship quilts or inscribed quilts or album quilts. And they stayed a popular thing to do and to give and to make through the middle years of the 19th century. The earliest documented quilt for a cause is an inscribed quilt. And it's this quilt. It's in the collection of Historic New England. And it is a cradle quilt attributed to Lydia Maria Child, made for an anti-slavery fair in Boston in 1836 or 1837. And I've included a close-up of this inscription in the central square, which has the first two stanzas of this poem. And I don't need to read it to you, but I will read the first. Mother, when around your child you clasp your arms in love, and when with grateful joy you raise your eyes to God above, think of the Negro mother when her child is torn away, sold for little slave. Oh, then for the poor mother, pray. During the Civil War, many quilts were made for soldiers. The United States Sanitary Commission was founded to, in our terminology today, get stuff to the boys where they needed them, in camps, in hospitals, and on the battlefields. And the Sanitary Commission actually advised quilt makers to put patriotic symbols on the quilts made for Civil War soldiers and to inscribe them with messages for the boys. Many of the ladies' aid societies that were already affiliated with churches turned to become ladies' soldiers' aid societies. It's estimated there were about 8,000 ladies' aid societies in the North before the Civil War started. And within a few months of its beginning, that number swelled to more than 20,000 ladies' soldiers' aid societies. The quilt on the left shows the Union shield in the center. It was made in Detroit, and it doesn't have a lot of patriotic or good messages for the boys, but every block is signed by someone who contributed a block. The quilt on the right is now held in the Maine State Historical Society. It lives in Augusta, Maine now. And that's pretty cool because it was made in Portland, Maine, by young women who were attending the Home Institute in Portland, kind of an 1860s finishing school. And every one of those blocks is heavily inscribed, as you can see. And they've got some very interesting, there are puns, there are verses from patriotic songs and hymns and poems. There are Bible verses, and there's health advice. So they were using these quilts. It's believed that some of the Sanitary Commission asked for quilts that were long and narrow for soldiers' beds, but some of the quilts that survive are wider, and it's believed that this one on the right was probably used for fundraising purposes. There are lots of quilts that have political statements on them, and we're not sure why the Nunda Lodge, as you can see in the upper left-hand image of that, made a quilt that celebrated General Grant, General Sherman, and It's Old Abe Forever, but they did. It was more common for quilts to contain campaign ribbons, as you can see in the inset on the right side. That's just a small portion of a very large silk quilt that has many of the campaign ribbons that were produced for Abe Lincoln and Hannibal Hamlin for his election in 1860. There are quilts that have, there's actually one called Whig's Defeat is the name of a pattern. The Whig Party was not popular with everybody, but there are very few quilt patterns from the 19th century that are named for politicians, but Whig's Defeat is one. Make sure I'm getting my notes going here. The end of the 19th century saw quilts that were made for fundraising for temperance. Not surprisingly, we know of only 2 or 3 quilts that were made to support women's suffrage, because the women who might have been making those quilts were out beating the pavement, raising money, advocating for women having the vote. This one is in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum. And if you want to look at some very interesting vignettes, you can go to their website and pull up good close-ups of this. If we had close-ups of all of the blocks, the circular blocks have vignettes of this woman who you can see in her pony cart on the right, headed to the women's rights meeting. She lectures to them. And if you can see my cursor, this little block here shows her husband standing at the table. On the floor is a spilled pot, a broom, and their infant child sitting under the table looking hungry because mama's away and papa has been left home to feed her. The quilt on the left is the second quilt that we know that was probably made for fundraising for suffrage. And the quilt on the right is a quilt that was, I believe it's called the, oh, now I've just lost the word. When everybody signs a document because you're in support of an object, it's called a, you guys can tell me afterwards. Petition. Thank you. Petition quilt. Every block in that quilt came from a different state, and every state signed petitions supporting temperance, which is against alcohol. And the Women's Christian Temperance Union has this in their collection, as well as several other quilts that were made for fundraisers for temperance. During World War I, these are not so much political as they are quilts for a cause. It was a fundraiser for the American Red Cross for you to organize a quilt for fundraising. And what you did is you got your friends to sign slips of paper and pay you from probably a dime, for some others a quarter. And some of these quilts exist that have the quilt in the collection of the New England Quilt Museum has 840 signatures on it. There are other quilts that were made during World War I that have even more signatures on it. But fundraising for the cause is another use for quilt making. Now, talk about another relevant topic, the quilt on the left. So there was a lag from the time of temperance through the when quilts were being used for fundraising through the 19 teens and 20s. There was a lag in quilts being used to make some kind of statement. Women in Boise, Idaho got together and dreamed up an idea that if they had cultural exchanges with people in Russia, that we could form closer bonds and show our likenesses instead of our differences. Several national peace quilts were made. This one is in the collection of the Soviet Women's Peace Committee. And what I was going to look it up for this, I forgot. I don't know what the Soviet women exchanged for the peace quilts. It may be that the Boise Peace Project owns quilts that were made by Soviet women, but I will look that up for the next time. The quilt on the right is the Hudson River quilt, a group of quilters who were concerned about the environmental hazard that the Hudson River had become, got together and made this quilt to raise awareness about the ecological mess that was going on in the Hudson River. And it did lead to a cleanup that's begun and is ongoing. Now, Jean Ray Laurie is one of my favorite quilt artists. She is also considered one of the first quilt artists. She got her master's degree in fine arts in the late 1950s, and for her master's thesis, she made what has become an art quilt. This is not it, but she went on to make quilts that made even stronger statements. And I just love this one. Once upon a time, there was a senator from Arkansas. In a famous speech, he said, "I'll tell you what we do up here in Perry County when one of our women starts poking around something she doesn't know anything about. We get her an extra milk cow. If that don't work, we give her a little more garden to tend. And if that's not enough, we get her pregnant and keep her barefoot." And that's where the expression of pregnant and barefoot in the kitchen comes. Jean Ray Laurie had a wonderful sense of humor. And if younger members don't get the dead rabbit in the pregnant block, I believe the background to pregnancy tests had something to do with experiments on rabbits. Somebody who knows can fill me in on that later, but that's what I'm remembering. Faith Ringgold is an artist who was, again, classically trained. She taught art school. She taught art in New York City schools for many years. And she's famous now for her stories. You probably have her books in your library. And she's also famous for her story quilts. And this is her first one. It's called Who's Afraid of Aunt Jemima? It combines traditional folk storytelling with quilting in the narrative. Ringgold transforms Aunt Jemima into a successful businesswoman, and the images on the quilt include her family members, her opinions of them, and what they became after her death, after Aunt Jemima dies in a car accident on the way to open her first restaurant. Ringgold did paint and sculpt first, but she began making quilts, and her repertoire includes sculptures, performance arts, and, as I said, children's book. Her work frequently focuses on feminist and anti-racist issues. Probably one of the more famous quilt projects for raising awareness is the Names Project. The quilt was conceived in November of 1985 by gay rights activist Cleve Jones. For years, Jones had helped organize the annual Candlelight March honoring San Francisco gay activists who were assassinated. While planning the 1985 march, he learned that over 1,000 San Franciscans had been lost to AIDS. He asked each of his fellow marchers to write on large cards the names of friends or loved ones who had died of AIDS. At the end of the march, Jones and others stood on ladders, taping these placards to the walls of the San Francisco Federal Building. To Jones, the wall of names looked like a patchwork quilt. He was inspired by this image, and he and friends made plans for a larger memorial. A little more than a year later, he created the first panel for the AIDS Memorial Quilt in memory of his friend, Marvin Feldman. In June of 1987, Jones teamed with Mike Smith and several others to formally organize the Names Project Foundation. In October 1987, the quilt was displayed for the first time on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. during the National March on Washington for Lesbian and Gay Rights. It covered a space larger than a football field and included 1,920 panels. More than 500,000 people visited the quilt that weekend. It was displayed in its entirety several other times, the last in 1996. The purpose of using the Names Project to not just memorialize those who died, but it was to raise awareness about the disease. And since then, the Names Project is still active. Schools or organizations can borrow panels. And like an organization that I once worked with called ABC Quilts, which stood for At-Risk Baby Crib Quilts, the organizers of this project help people make panels and include age-appropriate information about the best choices for sex, drugs, and alcohol. All right, my notes are over. So from now on, it's just more recent quilts. Quilts have been used to honor and memorialize people. These two are from an exhibit about women in power and who have been inspiration to others that was held in Houston in 2017. And I had forgotten about the modern quilts that I included in this. If you are familiar with the work of Jackie Gehring, she is one of the leaders of the modern quilt movement. And her husband works with disadvantaged youth in Chicago, and too often comes home with stories about gun violence. We exhibited Jackie's work, and it's very strong and very moving, but it brings a message about gun violence. And now for some of the quilts that were featured as part of the Threads of Resistance. I was moved by this one, which is, to me, I want to make it very clear, I am not anti-gun, but I strongly personally feel that we need not gun control, but gun registration. And to see our beloved Capitol building represented with images of assault rifles, to me was very strong statement. There were several quilts that talked about free speech and the power of women to use their voices. What does an American look like is on the far right. Deb Cashett and Chris, I can't, oh shoot, I didn't mean to do that, sorry. Chris Kazaki is the daughter of Japanese immigrants, or actually she's fourth generation now, but her grandparents were incarcerated as part of the World War II fear that the California Japanese community needed to be moved to relocation into camps where they were held during World War II. Here's another quilt that brings to light the importance of immigration in our country over history. And this activist quilt features a chair, which represents the number of chairs that need to be filled by people who want to make a difference. And Julie Weinstein's statement to me was very strong. Whatever your issue, work for change. Vote, participate, and work to fill legislative seats. I think this is my last image for tonight. This was featured, I don't know how many of you got over to the Museum of Fine Arts for their extraordinary Fabric of a Nation quilt exhibit. Carolyn Maslumi is a retired rocket scientist who is now a very talented quilter and a curator of very strong exhibits about race. The Strange Fruit was a song that talked about the Black people who were lynched. And that is my last image. All right, I see 2 questions in the chat. Joanne, which quilt were you talking about? Oh, yes, it was. I know which quilt you mean. It was there. It's in the collection of the MFA now. Yep. The suffragist quilt.
Yeah, I recognize several.
Yeah.
That were that yeah, that was the American flag with all the signatures.
Yes.
On it.
Yeah. We did some I was a highlight of my career to be asked to the MFA to examine the quilt. Yep. So for years, people have thought it was a suffrage quilt because, and I'm not finding it easily, it has Susan B. Anthony's name embroidered in it. But it was assumed that she had signed it for many years. But when Jennifer got it and started doing the research on it, they did the genealogy on a good 3/4 of the people who are mentioned here. The quilt probably wasn't made until well after Susan B. Anthony's death, because some of the children whose names appear on this weren't born until 1906 or 1910. What's interesting about it is it's made in the fashion of one of the patterns that was published in 1861 for making Civil War soldiers' quilts. So the people who put this thing together you probably again had to pay 25 cents to $1 to have your name included on the quilt, but we're pretty sure it was a fundraising. So someone's asking, first question is, what can we see at the Quilt Museum these days? We currently have an exhibit up of bird quilts from the Studio Art Quilter Association. They are just absolutely gorgeous art quilts. In the Genre Gallery, which is a smaller exhibit space, we have an exhibit of quilts having to do with, are you familiar with the word Gaia, which for some of us means Mother Earth? The quilt exhibit is called For the Love of Gaia. And there are some quilts that celebrate our Mother Earth, and there are some quilts that have meaning to those of us who are worried about climate change. And then the third exhibit, we actually have 4 exhibits up. Barb Vetter is a traditional quilt maker. She also makes modern quilts. And we have 32 of her small quilts that are in part of our galleries. And the reason I included her is because every one of her traditional quilts has a bird in it. She's adopted the sparrow as her totem. And then in our Donahue gallery, which we always put out between 8 and 12 quilts from our collection, our brilliant collection manager, Laura Lane, chose quilts from our collection that have trees to go along with the birds and the environmental quilts. So that's what we have going. We change out our exhibits about every quarter. So you'll have, in 1 year, we'll have between 12 and 16 exhibits. And the smallest exhibit might just be, as I said, 8 to 10 quilts. I think there are 26 bird quilts and there are 14 Gaia quilts. And as I said, there are 30 something of Barb Vetter's quilts. And plus we have a wonderfully revamped, we have a fantastic new manager of our museum shop. Everything, we don't sell quilting fabric, but we have a lot of quilt related and just plain old good stuff to purchase. So the question from Linda, the mistress in the castle. I'm afraid that I put up a slide that I can't completely explain. I'm remembering the lion and the unicorn as being part of the French, what's the right word for iconography at the time, but I promise that I will look it up, or anybody can do a quick Google right now and find it and tell us. The Gee's Bend quilts and their significance. The Gee's Bend quilts are made by African-American quilters who live in Gee's Bend. And the significance is that they, here we get into terminology. People would say that they are outsider art or folk art. They're quilts made of materials on hand by women who are masters at rhythm and use of fabric, and making a denim quilt made of somebody's scraps from somebody's jeans look like modern art. They're just fantastic. And their significance is that the Gee's Bend quilts, when they first began to be exhibited in museums, really made people understand that just because it's made of fabric, it doesn't mean it's art. And no, I haven't seen the Plymouth tapestry in Pilgrim Hall. It's a 40-yard tapestry being embroidered, interpreting the Pilgrim experience in honor of the 400th anniversary of Plymouth. Embroiderers are working as we speak. And those are the questions and comments that we have.
Pam, I had Nikki, this is Nikki from the Natick Historical Society. I have a question for you about, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the public life of some of the older quilts. I think when it comes to the newer quilts, we know a lot about how they were displayed and what that community engagement looked like. Do we know as much about some of the older quilts and how people may have engaged with them or not? So is there anything to be learned about the sort of level of public engagement that some of these quilts may have had in the 19th and early 20th centuries?
Yes, there are 2 examples that come to mind immediately. I'll make it 3. So the Sanitary Commission, the US Sanitary Commission during the Civil War, in the 2nd or 3rd year of the war, began to run out of money. And they decided to do a series that every state had its, and many of the large cities had its own sanitary commission organization. And they began holding fairs. Think of your local church fair on steroids. For instance, the New York City United States Sanitary Fair had buildings constructed for it. And there was the fine arts department, and there was the home department. And in the building that housed the home department, there were quilts that were exhibited I believe 800,000 or 1 million people went through the New York Sanitary Fair, and it raised a lot of money. But quilts were on public display, and they were raffled, and they were purchased. The second thing that comes to mind, I talked about the signature quilt fad from the 1830s to the 1880s. Probably, yes, there must have been a public aspect. One of the most enduring parts of that fad were groups of women who got together and made a signature quilt for an esteemed pastor. So if we were part of a church group making a gorgeous quilt for a pastor just because we loved him in his service, or because he and his wife were leaving to go to a different calling, I can't imagine that they didn't display that quilt in the church. There had to be a public aspect to that. But as far as large exhibitions that we have, museums dedicated to quilts, only the sanitary fairs. I take it back. Then the large expositions started. The Philadelphia exposition for the centennial had quilt sections. There were quilts that were displayed there. There is evidence that someone put together an exhibit of antique quilts in the 1920s, but I'm not remembering specifically what the reference was. There was a large quilt, a national quilt competition in 1933 for the World's Fair in Chicago. And some pretty spectacular quilts were made for that with beautiful modern designs, but they awarded the grand prize to an antique reproduction quilt. So those are pretty public aspects of quilt making, I think. I see 2 new comments in the chat. Oh, here we go. I read once that quilts were used as maps for the Underground Railroad. Women would hang them on clotheslines to direct folks north. Is this well known? It's very well known. A better question, is it true? No, it's not. It is a myth. When historians of any kind want to write about something, we look for at least 3 sources. And there's only ever been one direct source for what we now call the myths of the quilt code. And to use your example, people would hang them on clotheslines to direct folks north. Well, the people who were escaping slavery were traveling at night. And how would they ever see a quilt? So the most common thing that people ask about, well, I heard that if you saw a log cabin with a black center, it meant a safe house. Well, how are the streetlights? How are you going to see something hanging on somebody's fence at night? But beyond that, there certainly were symbols that African Americans have used for generations in their textiles, but there is no quilt code. The myth came from one source. It was a story told to an avid quilt historian in a market in South Carolina, and I'm going to get everything wrong, but the name of the book is Hidden in Plain Sight, or Hidden in Plain View. It was co-written by a professor of African American history, but with all of the interviews that were done with former slaves as part of the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s. With the Quakers had a huge amount to do with the Underground Railroad, and they recorded lots and lots of stuff, but nothing was ever recorded about a quilt code. And what's made the quilt code myth travel is, admittedly, it's a wonderful story. But in the book that was written about it, she shows blocks that were supposedly part of the quilt code. And 2 of the blocks that she claims were part of the quilt code were never seen in any American quilt before 1920. So I don't know why she thought a sailboat that we see in 1920s and 30s quilts for the first time was around in the 1840s and 50s, because it wasn't. You are very welcome. It's my least favorite question in the entire world because people love the story so much. And I've actually had people yell at me because I tell the truth about it. But if your library wants your library probably has Hidden in Plain View. But no, I'm fine. I'm a big girl. It has to be squashed. But look for the work of Barbara Brackman. She's a highly regarded quilt historian who is dug and dug and dug, and she's one of the ones who most respectfully writes about it. And oh, by the way, gang, George Washington didn't chop down any cherry trees, and Betsy Ross didn't make the flag. Back to another question. How many quilt museums are there? If the New England Quilt Museum ever closed, your next closest quilt museum is Virginia. There are 14 quilt museums or parts of universities that have major quilt collections that in my definition, you have to give regular exhibitions of your collection. The coolest one in the world is the International Quilt Museum in Lincoln, Nebraska. It's interesting why it ended up in Lincoln, Nebraska, and it was because Lincoln, Nebraska at the time, their university had a wonderful fashion design and marketing, which took the International Quilt Collection under their wing. And it's just, I think their collection is approaching 10,000 quilts. The New England Quilt Museum has about 500, and we exhibit our quilts as much as we can. I don't see any new ones. Any new questions, comments?
This is Nikki again. I had another question, and it's partly related to the enthusiasm for the myth, right? And why that has such enduring resonance, and probably has to do with reconciliation efforts after the Civil War. But I also think that people love the idea of women sort of using fiber arts to do political work, to do civic work, right? To sort of bring this domestic product into this public space. And it got me thinking about the title of your talk, which is soft protests. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, where that thinking came from and sort of, your process in choosing these quilts and gathering them together under that theme of soft protests.
So the soft protest is, in my head, the protest can be a difficult topic. Is it softened physically by using cloth, or is it softened because you think that quilts would carry a soft message, an easier message to listen to? So getting back to your question, why you think people love the myth of the Underground Railroad so well, first of all, if it had happened, it would never have been public. It would have been as secret as possible. So I think people love it when history is romanticized. And I'm going to get out on a big fat limb here. But do people love that myth so much because it makes them feel better about slavery? That something as wonderful as a quilt might have been used to make the journey easier for people trying to escape slavery? I don't think I've seen anything written about that. I'll have to dig into that one as too. Did I hit what you were after?
That's a great, I was just going to say, that's a great dissertation waiting to be written by somebody. Yes, and I was wondering if the soft protest, is that something that you're working with within the rubric of your work, or is it a known term in quilting history having to do with gender and the sort of feminine arts coming into the masculine public sphere?
I stole it from earlier curators at the New England Quilt Museum because there was an exhibit of quilts with statements. I'd have to go back and look, I think mid 1990s. And they chose, so the quilts that were in Threads of Resistance, I showed you the softer ones. They were some really edgy ones. There were images, for instance, of the Statue of Liberty with a knife in her back, and some very strong, very violent images. I chose images that were easier to look at, but that express strong concerns about where our world is headed. Soft protests, yeah, I didn't plagiarize it. I asked our collections manager was on the committee that put that together. She was fine with me using that title, but you like a catchy title.
It's a great title.
Thank you. All right, I will not discuss a potential donation online. If you're interested in making a donation to the museum, please email me at, the easiest one online is pamela.weeks@gmail.com with images of the quilt. I will answer the inquiry about a donation generally. It's making me very sad these days. We normally would get, maybe 2, sometimes 3 inquiries per month from people who were looking to house their family quilts or their quilt collections. And your question, today's Tuesday. This is the 3rd inquiry that we've had since yesterday about people donating quilts to the museum. Generally, my son said it to me, "Mom, I don't want your stuff. You better get rid of it before you die." And I'm not the only one who's experiencing that kind of thing. We've had lots and lots of people. So in general, we would accept a quilt only if it's in excellent condition, if it has provenance that's strong. It does not have to be your family's provenance. It can be someone else's provenance, at least where it was made and by whom. And then in my criteria, I've had to add, it has to be highly exhibitable. If it doesn't have a strong visual impact, then we would not be accepting it, because we do try to exhibit all of our quilts. Many fine art museums are now collecting quilts. Is this a concern to quilt museums? No. It validates what we've been trying to do for the past 35 years, which is to have quilts accepted as statements or as art. It gets me excited. The only thing that bothers me about fine arts museums collecting quilts, and please all raise your right hand, and I didn't say this, is, I don't have to apologize. Jennifer Swope, in a gallery talk at the Museum of Fine Arts, said, "This was donated 125 years ago. It's the first time we've exhibited it." So that's my only concern about fine arts museums is, will the quilt that you donated ever be exhibited? It will certainly be beautifully taken care of. It is a great boon to collectors or researchers that so many museums are putting their quilt collections, their entire art collections, online. But no, I'm not concerned about it. I'm excited that fine arts museums are collecting. Wendy Jocelyn wants to know, are contemporary quilters still hand stitching, or are they machine stitched? So the majority of new work that I'm seeing is at least machine pieced. Many people are still doing handwork. There is a movement called I think it's called just the slow movement or slow stitching, in which hand quilting is making a big comeback. I do everything. I machine quilt, I hand quilt, I machine piece, I hand piece, I machine applique, and I hand applique. It depends on the project and what I want to do. And we have a request. Actually, I see someone starting to write a note about, I tried calling NEQM redonating books to our library. We're currently on hold. The library is overflowing, and we are actually purging some of our early how-to books. Pardon me. But keep trying again. And you want the museum number, and extension 15 is the library. And I had someone request that I go back to the very first slide, which is of Trump kissing Putin. What I do not have with me here at home is the the artist statement from this quilt. It is from a painting. The quilt artist contacted the artist who created the first iteration of this image, and he gave her joyful permission to go ahead and make it into a quilt.